Thanks very much. I hope everybody can hear me. I'm going to keep my voice up. I describe myself as an adopted Wexford man because I'm from Wicklow, but since I moved down Wexford Way, I seldom go up Wicklow Way. So just to say, I'm based in Enniscorthy, and about 14 years ago I bought my first laptop computer, and up to that time I used to be listening to the Pat Kenny and RTE1, and had a certain understanding of how the world worked. And when I bought my laptop computer and I picked up broadband, because they told me I wouldn't pick up broadband where I lived, but I did, and there's no exaggeration to say the information I came across changed the course of my life. And I was somebody who was a big believer in the system. I used to listen to, I used to buy the Sunday business post every Sunday. And, I had a certain understanding of the world, and I was well into my 40s, and I came across information on the alternative media on the internet, which changed the course of my life. And one of the areas I came across was energy. I trained as a lab technician in Carlow IT, I don't want to say how many years ago, but technical people are kind of nosy or curious, they like to know how things work. And I came across Patrick Kelly's website, okay? And Patrick Kelly is a dull man, unfortunately died there in July of 2020. I only found that out before Christmas. And when I logged on to his website, I began to study. And being a curious person, I kept researching, and looked at electricity and electrical at first, and then I didn't feel I was drawn towards that, or I had great skills there. But I was drawn to the idea of water as a fuel. And, over a lot of time, I began to build up an understanding of how the technology worked, and I began to be drawn to water and learned a lot of extraordinary things about the water that I had no idea was imparted into the properties of water. So I propose to talk tonight about just what I call mainstream energy and then alternative energy. And I leave the free energy till the next night, which will hopefully be 2 weeks from now. And the original talk was an hour and 48 minutes, and I thought that's not going to go down too well, you better cut it in half. So I asked Seamus there 2 days ago, could I cut it in half? And I think it's, I'll talk for 50 minutes. I don't want to run you all out of the room, And maybe we'll have some questions and answers. And if you have a question, I'd be delighted to hear it, because sometimes the best part of a talk is when questions are asked of the speaker, or anyone else can contribute also. So I'll just make a start here. I have some notes here. I don't particularly want to be reading stuff out, but I've got a lot of information that's not so easy to compartmentalize or put into my head, So I have pointers and prompts here to help me out, okay? So I just say Ireland uses about 152,000 barrels of crude oil per day. That's an extraordinary amount of oil for a population of 5 million. And 1 barrel of oil is about 159 litres. So if you multiply that up, that works out at about 4.9 litres per man, woman and child of crude oil that's used in Ireland every single day. And a man in Carlow, I don't know him, but he tweeted, Con Murphy, in 2008 crude oil hit record prices of 143 euros per barrel. This was reflected at the pumps where petrol cost 120 per litre. Today crude oil is lower at 120 euros per barrel, and however the pump price is at 220. So he's just making the point, contrary to what's being told by those in the media, but the government itself is putting the price of fuel up, extraordinary. That's like an 80% increase. This is what we can expect now for the next few years in this country. Out of control government, and what are we going to do about it? Con Murphy also said there about 4 days ago, Electric Ireland are putting up their electricity bills by 10.9% and gas bills by 29.2% from August. Electric Ireland is the real division of the ESB, which is 95% state-owned. Okay? That's something to think about. Not good news. I'm just using the example of how much hydrocarbon fuel is used in the world here. A jumbo jet flying from Greece to New York used 150 tons of aviation fuel. That's like four 40-foot containers of fuel. You can imagine 4 trucks weighing 40 tons. That's cruising at 550 miles an hour probably. What? Yeah, well actually it's a good point because about half the weight of the aircraft is aviation fuel. If any plane is flying any kind of distance. That's why if they have to turn around and go back in land, if they have a technical problem, hopefully not too serious, they have to dump the fuel. Because the wheels can't handle the weight, you know. It's an extraordinary amount of fuel. The Concorde, which is of course gone now, but I just listened to a video there. The Concorde leaving the passenger terminal and taxiing out on just to take off, not taking off, it used 800 kilos of fuel, you know. And, articulated trucks, I don't know, they use 5 to 7 miles per gallon of diesel. I think the Euro trucks maybe do a bit better, but not a lot. And the main energy source in Ireland is electricity and hydrocarbon. Now, you notice I'm not using the word fossil fuel, and I'll talk about that later. That basically is natural gas, petrol, diesel, and coal in Ireland. It's all about hydrogen. All the energy system that we know is all based on the tiny little atom at the beginning of the periodic table called hydrogen, and it is only a weight of 1. Okay, and it's an energy carrier. When hydrogen and oxygen come together in a petrol engine with a spark, the 2 atoms come together and they form water. So the ideal fuel would be water. Isn't that interesting? Instead of hydrocarbon fuel, where you've got CO2 and CO given off. Okay. So just to say the words energy, heat, power and work are all interrelated terms for the world we live in. You know, it's one implies the other. And there's some breakup of gases in the atmosphere. Nitrogen is 78%, okay? And oxygen is 21%, approximately. And water is 0 to 4%, okay? And carbon dioxide, this is the great killer, this is the thing that's killing us all, is 0.036%, you know. Does anyone believe in that? That's 3.6 parts per 10,000, you know. That's how small it is. And I just say almost half, or 46% of our electricity is generated from natural gas fueled power stations. 1/7 comes from coal, and 1/3 of our power is generated from indigenous sources like wind, which is 18%, heat, 8.8%, and hydroelectricity is only 2.5%, very small. And the Irish government plans to get 70% of electricity from renewables, such as wind and solar, by 2030. Okay, so they're going to push out this solar and this wind nonsense, you know, that we see everywhere. And to clarify, 70% of electricity is equivalent to about 40% of all our energy needs. Electricity is 1/5 of the energy we consume each day. Okay. And our own natural gas and oil that's off the coast, this is something that runs fairly rough on people, because in the 1970s, 1980, the state would have held 50% in any energy extraction company, and 8% royalties and tax at the rate of 50%. In 1985, the government began eroding the shares in our own resources to multinationals. These multinationals now own, as I understand it, they own 100%. You know? There's a quote from a director of Statoil, and Statoil is the Norwegian state oil company, and I think they have taken over some of the platforms here off the coast. But one executive made the comment, no country in the world is given as favourable terms to the oil companies as Ireland has. Okay? He's not beating around the bush there, he's telling you, you know. And just in the American college, I lived in the US 8 years, and I'm kind of influenced by that to a certain extent, you know. But I lived there from 85 to 94. And just recently the chairman of Lee Raymond, chairman of CEO of ExxonMobil, right, speaking at a U.S. Congress meeting, and he said the annual consumption of oil and natural gas is $2.5 trillion per year. Now, he made this statement about 8 years ago. In 25 years, the global demand will increase by 50%. And this guy was on a salary at that time of $400 million a year. You know. So I just get into the oil, the way it's, you know, because the general public are told a certain understanding of the oil business. But you know, I started my research 15 years ago. I'm one of the people that you keep coming up on the alternative media, the Rockefeller family, and in particular John D. Rockefeller. And he started off in the oil business in 1870. Okay, started off as a small enough operator, but he devised a plan to take over the oil industry in the United States, and he did that by subversion and coercion and underpricing the competition, and slowly but surely over a period of 30 years, he basically got a monopoly position through his company Standard Oil in the United States, and he became the first American billionaire. Okay, so when he done that, he was introduced to the idea by one of his underlings. You know, these multi-rich people, they have all their technical and understanding people from their, you know, it was made. The proposition was put to him, did you ever think of going into the pharmaceutical industry? And this is when we start to see how the world works. So Rockefeller commissioned Abraham Flexner to write a report to Congress recommending that we would concentrate on pharmaceutical industry as it was more science-based, supposedly, and we would defund alternative medicine, basically. And that's what they've done. They were also able to use the hydrocarbon fuel as the raw material in their medicinal, whatever stuff they came up with. So in 1911, the Rockefeller had his monopoly through Standard Oil, and basically he had such a control over the system that the U.S. Congress broke up Standard Oil and what made Rockefeller even twice as rich as he already was. And they would be companies like Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco, Gulf, Texaco, and BP and Shell, I think, are in Europe. So Rockefeller then also bought IG Farben in Germany. And that's a big, you know, anyone who does their research knows the IG Farben, big German operation. It was particularly active in the Second World War, making all sorts of herbal concoctions. And another thing you'll hear from oil people is people who work in, you know, these eggheads that you see in mainstream media, you know, they use the term fossil fuel. Now, the term fossil fuel was brought around by Rockefeller to create in the minds of the general public that there's a scarcity of oil and that all oil is derived from the bodies of little animals or big animals, I don't know, but coming from an organic source, because animals are all made up of carbon. Organic chemistry tells us that. But of course it's not true, but it's repeated ad nauseum on mainstream and even on alternative media, this term fossil fuels. Proper term is hydrocarbon fuels. And it's, you know, again, because I hear so many eggheads using this term fossil fuels, you know. But, so I would say if you go to your doctor, right, he is trained in a certain way in the supply and administration of pharmaceutical drugs. Most of you here know this stuff. But he is trained in a medical school that's part funded by the Rockefeller operations. And the Irish Medical Council control all this. And they all make a nice living out of it. The overall way they treat the patient is not good. It's mostly, if you hear, no. Allopathic medicine is primary, you know, and it's a controlled system, and doctors who have spoken out, and a few of them did speak out during the so-called pandemic, that they, you know, they just take away their license, you know. And doctors enjoy a certain status in society, and they, you know, they make a good living, and you know, a lot of them don't want that to change. And no matter what reservations they may have had about what went on here 2 years ago, with the scam and fraud that went on. So I'm just saying, Rockefeller controls about half the pharmaceutical industry in the United States, as far as I know. And when you go to the filling station, you're getting their fill up from hydrocarbon fuel. Now, they have since sold their oil interests, okay, that needs to be said, in anticipation of us all moving into electrical cars, you know, by 2030 or what have you. And you know, they've formed alliances with government. I mean, these guys are smart, you know. I mean, the government controls the whole thing, and it's arranged through acts and statutes that we use the hydrocarbon fuel, you know, and extracting the maximum monetary benefit. Now, I want to move on to another thing here that really took my notice, and this is something that happened in the 1970s, right? Just to give you an example, hopefully a truthful example of what's going on in the world, okay? And the gentleman by the name of Evan McMullen of Cosmopolitan Motors in Seattle, Washington, D.C., and he talks on a YouTube video about a competition that was held in the 70s by Shell Oil to see how far they could get a car to go on 1 gallon of gasoline. Okay, now, as far as I know, this was in the US, and that's important because the US gallon is 3.78 litres and the UK gallon is 4.54 litres. Okay, 14% difference. And so the engineers picked their respective cars and they made their customizations and they held the competition. Would anyone care to guess what the winning car got in terms of miles per gallon? Anyone care to venture a guess?
60.
Okay. No, the winning car got 376 miles per gallon. And when people hear that, say that's got to be a mistake. You know, and this is well documented at the time. It's not a mistake. How could they possibly get 300 on in a regular car? Well, it's very simple, really. You vaporize the fuel because hydrocarbon fuel doesn't burn in liquid form. Okay, so basically, in an internal combustion engine, under the mechanic or one or two here, 2/3 of the fuel is not burning at all because it's in liquid form. Only the fuel that's in vapor form burns in the engine. The rest goes back out the exhaust into the catalytic converter. That's what the catalytic converter is there for, is to supposedly neutralize that hydrocarbon fuel. You know, but that's not what we're told. You know. So the winning car was an old Opel and it had 2,500 pounds weight, so it wasn't like, it was about an average European car in weight. And another important thing about this, almost as equally important as the miles per gallon they got, was when you vaporize the fuel, you also dramatically reduce the emissions. You know? And I'm not talking about half or 10% or I don't know the exact figure, but you dramatically reduce the emissions. So I'm just thinking someone should talk to Eamon Ryan about this and maybe put forward the idea, you know, maybe we should be vaporizing the fuel and then we solve the global warming plan. And I'm sure you'd be very interested. Do you think you'd be interested? No, I don't think he'd be interested. I don't think he's interested at all. Because that doesn't fall on the agenda. And so anyway, so that's just an example that puts in some kind of context what's going on. Anyone here is entitled to question what I'm saying. You know, I'm no expert in all of this. But, can you leave the questions till afterwards, please? And Tom Ogle was a young American chap in his early 20s in New Mexico. And he was young, like I say, a handy fella with his hands, and he was messing around with a lawnmower one day, you know, and he says he accidentally put a hole in the fuel tank. And he got the idea of running a vacuum hose from the fuel tank, taking out the carburetor out of the lawnmower and running it directly into the lawnmower. And he said he ran the lawnmower for 96 hours. You know, that's okay. Now there are issues with vaporizing fuel. One is you have to heat the fuel tank, you know, and so it needs to be reinforced. The second thing is, like I say, you don't use a fuel pump or a carburetor in this. Second thing is the engine will tend to overheat, and that you have to make changes for that. Okay, but that can be done, and he solved those problems. He converted an American car, and you know the American cars of the 70s were big, like 4,000 pounds. It's heading on for maybe 80% bigger than what we would already know as a car, as a European car, and to do 100 miles per gallon. And I just go back and say there to what I was talking about, the Shell oil competition. I'm not saying every car on the road can do 376 miles per gallon or anything like it, okay? I'm saying what any car on the road could be doing 3 or 4 times the miles per gallon that it's doing, okay? That's more reasonable. Remember, that was the winning car, and they put asbestos around the engine on that car, which over time would have seized the engine if you drove it far enough, okay? And going back to Tom Ogle, he developed the technology for the automobile basically, and he filed his patents, and he got investment, and he was all set to go. He was going to set up a chain of conversion centres all around America, and he did set up one. And his problems started to arise when he was offered 25 million for his business, okay? This is a typical scenario of what happens when someone comes with a disruptive technology and he refuses it, okay? So when that happens, the directive comes down from the top of the pyramid to make that problem go away. So they shot him. He died immediately. He was leaving the smugglers in El Paso, Texas, but did not die. He went to a friend's apartment and collapsed, and he died in the El Paso Eastwood Hospital. His death was ruled accidental. You know, it's a typical scenario. And just a little experiment there for anyone at all. If you pour some gasoline onto a flat surface, like the top of a lid of a saucepan maybe, and you light it, and obviously use precautions, maybe do it outside, and you bring your head down to the level with the fuel and watch the fuel as the flame is sitting well up off the fuel, because it's only the vapor that's burning. The liquid doesn't burn. Okay. The Poe carburetor was also Charles Nelson Poe, September 1897 to 85, and he was a Canadian mechanic and inventor of the Poe carburetor, which was claimed to do 200 miles per gallon. Now that Poe car never, to the best of my knowledge, it never went into commercial production, because they were using carburetors in the 60s and 70s. So I wanted to move on to the diesel engine, and the diesel engine, there's probably everyone here is familiar with the diesel engine. It was invented by Rudolf Diesel, 1858 to 1913, okay? It's a wonderful engine, although a lot, environmentalists say, no, it's not a wonderful. I'd say it is a wonderful engine, because the diesel engine, if the fuel was vaporized going into it, the emissions would come down dramatically. It's the workhorse of all industry, the diesel engine is. It powers the world, all buses, all heavy goods vehicles, all tractors, all trucks, all boats, all ships. I mean, they're all running on diesel, are they not? With very few differences, And 2/3 of the cars on the road in Ireland, if I'm not mistaken, are diesel. Now, there was a time there was no diesel cars on the road. The Mercedes were the first to introduce it, way back in the 50s, And the diesel engine develops more power when under stress, like going up hills and such, that petrol wouldn't be able to handle. And the diesel is a larger molecule. They're both petrol and diesel are hydrocarbon fuels, CH, but there's just more in the diesel than the petrol. There's more CHs, if you will, and it's all done by refraction in the oil industry. Now, Rudolf Diesel died under strange circumstances. This happens to people in this industry a lot. He was travelling from Antwerp in Belgium to London, England by ship, and he disappeared. He was not to be seen. He was gone off the ship, and his body turned up a week later. This is a man that would have been earning probably serious money from royalties from his diesel engine, and he's gone. And it's a mystery what happened to him. Some people think the German government might have arranged an exit for him because he was given the UK the use of his diesel technology, and they didn't want that, Okay. So I go on to nuclear energy here, okay, because this is another significant energy industry. And Marie Curie and her husband Pierre Curie made considerable contribution to the understanding of nuclear power development. Okay, Marie Curie was a French scientist, and her husband was French. She and her husband and some others were awarded the Nobel Prize, and she herself some years later was awarded the Nobel Prize. Very brilliant woman. But she died young in her 60s because she had been walking in and around nuclear. She died from radiation. You know. Her husband was killed in a motor accident earlier on in the. But I'm sure she had mixed. She knew the good and the bad of nuclear energy, and probably had mixed feelings about nuclear energy, I would imagine. You know. And there's 439 nuclear reactors in 30 countries around the world, and generates about a tenth of the electricity around the world. And it's a mature industry. Now, there is a move on by influences, and they did come across a bit on, an RTE website where, a highly credentialed individual from PCD or UCD was saying, we need to look at smaller modular nuclear power reactors for Ireland, So they kind of, they put in an opinion piece and kind of, push it that way. But these new modular are not available. These modular nuclear reactors are not available. So, in Ireland, any of us old enough know the story about Carnsore Point here in Ireland. I was a teenager at the time, but there was talk of setting up a nuclear power plant in Ireland, and there was quite a bit of protesting, but the reason it never went ahead officially was because Ireland, we didn't really have the population or probably the wealth to justify creating a nuclear, because it's quite an investment. But I sometimes say to myself, we don't have a nuclear power plant in operation in Ireland, but we have Sellafield, which is just across the road, as it were, a couple of 20 or 30 miles away, and they had a nuclear meltdown or whatever in the 1950s, and it was covered up. Sellafield, that is. And storage of nuclear waste is big business too. I work with Brown's gas, and it can be used, as far as I know, to neutralise the waste from these nuclear reactors, but nobody wants to look at it because there's big money in the storage of it. And presently, the majority of electricity from nuclear power plants is derived from fission from uranium or plutonium. And there are plans, like, as I say, to develop this smaller nuclear model that, I don't know, that they're trying to get other countries interested in. The argument for a country's energy sources go from oil, which is hydrocarbon, to natural gas, which is also hydrocarbon, to coal, to nuclear, which is supplemental, and supplemental would be something like wind or solar. A free energy is never mentioned or discussed. Around the world, around and around it goes. Where it stops, nobody knows. It goes around in a certain limited understanding of what's available. The Europe Republic are not aware of free energy. I'll talk about that in 2 weeks, hopefully. So I wanted to move on to alternative energy and wind turbines, and I did a critique of wind turbines there. And you go out the door, you can see them there. And I drew down a series of pros and cons on wind turbines, okay? And a pro being something good, and a con being something bad. So I came up with one good and 18 cons. Con is an apt word, maybe. So I started off in my critique of wind turbines. First of all, they're an eyesore, okay? In America, it costs 2.6 to 4 million euro to erect a turbine. Now, they're usually of a bigger size than here in Ireland. And there's a vast amount of concrete which can fracture, which goes into the holes that they have to dig for that. Because I was living up in Knocknallower there, they did, and they set up like 4 turbines there, I think it's 4 or 5 of them. And I used to hear them coming at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, I suppose from the UK maybe, with all the paraphernalia to set up the turbines, But anyway, I'll leave it at later. The noise, it's a very strange experience living beside turbines, because there's all sorts of noise, and if the sun is shine in a certain way. You have a shadow that's maybe 2 or 3 miles running down the valley of a turbine. But my sister talked constantly about she could pick up a noise when she was trying to sleep. Now, it didn't bother me, and she lived right next door to me. That's not Glenarm now, which is just North County Wexford. That's where Wexford touches Wicklow. And it's undependable. Like, I mean, this is, nonsense technology. It only runs when the wind runs, How do you build a business model on that? And this is one you love. The general public must compensate wind turbine hours if wind does not blow. Check your bill. And I did check my bill. And because I didn't believe in the beginning, and true enough, there's a small print, 8 or 9 euros out of the bill goes to the people that are running the turbine facility to compensate them if the wind doesn't blow. They're not designed right to capture the full capacity of the wind. Blades cannot be recycled. The only option is to bury them. Okay, and they do that in America on a huge scale. I've seen videos of them burying thousands of wind turbine blades. Okay, the blades. Okay, and who will take down and recycle after 20 years? I wonder, where would these people that are behind all this alternative energy, this green supposed to be energy, And in case of strong winds, windmills have to be shut down. That kind of defies the whole existence. You would think when it's windy that they would be generating the maximum, but they can't because it's not feasible, And countries with the most wind turbines pay the most for electricity. Okay, that's interesting. And wind turbines can go on fire and not kill personnel doing maintenance who have fallen off the turbines doing the fires. Anyone going up, scaling up those wind turbines, man, even with the right paraphernalia, it's risky, The leading edge of the propeller degrades, leading to an underperforming turbine and it must be replaced. A Harvard University study found that wind turbines create more global warming than the hydrocarbon they eliminate, and the same is true of EV scooters and electric cars. Okay.